The Ashcroft Estate was not merely a home, it was a fortress of history, built from cold limestone and old secrets. Sitting high on a hill overlooking the Potomac, it stood as a silent sentinel to the power of one of America's most formidable dynasties. To the outside world, the estate was a symbol of unshakable strength, a place where presidents dined and policies were whispered over crystal glasses. But to Chloe, who spent her days in the suffocating silence of the East Wing, it was a mausoleum. Chloe was 24, a woman composed of soft edges and quiet intelligence, occupying a world designed for sharp ambition. She was the estate's archivist, a title that sounded grander than the reality. In truth, she was the keeper of the dust. She spent her hours in the cavernous, two-story library, cataloging decades of Ashcroft correspondence, ensuring that the family's legacy remained polished and pristine. She was invisible by design. Her brown wool skirts and sensible shoes allowed her to blend into the mahogany woodwork, a ghost haunting the margins of a life she could never touch. She came from nothing, a foster system that had shuffled her between overcrowded homes until she learned that silence was the only way to avoid trouble. This job was her lifeline, a fragile miracle granted by a scholarship program she had miraculously won. But keeping it required a total erasure of self. She learned to walk without making a sound on the parquet floors. She learned to lower her gaze when the family members swept past. She learned that in the Ashcroft world, you were either a player or a prop, and she was decidedly the latter. In a world of lions, the mouse survives by never moving a muscle. That rainy Tuesday in November, the atmosphere in the estate was brittle with tension. Gabriel Ashcroft, the eldest son and the family's golden hope for the upcoming Senate seat, was hosting a high-stakes fundraising gala. The library, usually Chloe's sanctuary, had been designated as a holding area for VIPs, but the storm outside had delayed their arrival. Chloe was frantically trying to finish restoring a fragile 19th-century ledger before the guests descended. The room smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the ozone of the approaching storm. Thunder rattled the high, arched windows, casting spasmodic flashes of lightning across the rows of leather-bound books. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she applied the binding glue. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching from the tension of being constantly watchful, constantly afraid of making a mistake that would send her back to the poverty she had fought so hard to escape. Suddenly, the heavy double doors groaned open. Chloe froze. It was too early for the guests. She expected the housekeeper, or perhaps security. Instead, Gabriel Ashcroft walked in. He was a man who sucked the oxygen out of any room he entered. Tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the entire estate, he wore a tuxedo that fit him with lethal precision. His face was a landscape of severe beauty, a sharp jawline, dark hair swept back, and eyes the color of obsidian, impenetrable and intense. He was the man the city feared and adored in equal measure, a titan of industry pivoting to politics, known for his ruthless intellect and his cold, untouchable demeanor. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in the ballroom, charming donors. Gabriel slammed the door shut behind him, leaning his forehead against the wood for a fleeting second, his posture radiating a profound, crushing exhaustion. For that brief moment, the mask slipped. He wasn't the senator in waiting. He was a man suffocating in his own life. Then he sensed her. He spun around, his body tensing like a coiled spring. His dark eyes scanned the room and locked onto Chloe, who was shrinking behind the large oak desk, clutching her glue brush like a weapon. I apologize, Mr. Ashcroft," Chloe stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just finishing the ledger. I didn't know you needed the room." Gabriel stared at her. He didn't speak immediately. His gaze was heavy, physical. He looked at her frayed cardigan, her messy bun held together by a pencil, the smudge of ink on her cheek. To anyone else, he looked annoyed. But if one looked closer, If one dared to look into the abyss of his eyes, there was something else. A flicker of recognition. A terrifying flash of hunger that he instantly suppressed behind a wall of ice. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood. He stopped at the other side of the desk, towering over her. The scent of him, rain, expensive scotch, and cold air, filled her senses, making her dizzy. "You are still here," Gabriel said. His voice was a deep baritone, rough and devoid of the charm he used for the cameras. It wasn't a question. It sounded almost like an accusation. I can leave, sir," Chloe whispered, terrified she had offended him. "I can take the back stairs." "The back stairs are flooded from the storm," Gabriel stated flatly. He looked at the ledger she was working on, then back at her face. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the way her hands were shaking. Silence is the only shield strong enough to hold a heart breaking. He reached out, his hand hovering over the desk. For a second, Chloe thought he might touch the ledger, or perhaps point to the door. But his hand lingered in the air between them, trembling imperceptibly. He wanted to reach for her. The urge was so violent it terrified him. He wanted to wipe the ink from her cheek. He wanted to tell her that she was the only real thing in his entire, manufactured world. But he knew the rules better than anyone. He knew that his enemies were watching. He knew that a scandal involving the help would destroy his campaign, but worse, it would destroy her. The media would tear her apart. His family would crush her. So, he did the only thing he could to save her. He became the villain. "You are clumsy, miss. Whatever your name is," Gabriel lied, his voice dripping with a fabricated disdain. He pulled his hand back, shoving it into his pocket. "You leave your tools out. You look disheveled. It reflects poorly on the house." Chloe flinched as if he had struck her. The words cut deep, confirming her worst fear, that she was nothing but a stain on his perfect world. She looked down, biting her lip to stop the tears. "I'm sorry, sir," she choked out. "I'll fix it." "See that you do," Gabriel snapped, turning his back to her to hide the agony in his own expression. "And stay out of sight tonight. The last thing I need is a distraction." He walked to the window, staring out at the storm, his back rigid. He had hurt her. He had to. It was the only way to make her leave the room before his resolve shattered. Chloe quickly gathered her things, her heart breaking in her chest, oblivious to the fact that the man standing at the window was watching her reflection in the glass with a look of desperate, longing despair. She fled the library, thinking she was despised, never knowing that she was the only soul he had ever truly seen. The days following the storm were quiet, but it was a heavy, loaded silence, like the air before a lightning strike. The Ashcroft Estate returned to its rhythmic precision. The gala debris was swept away by an army of caterers, the crystal was polished back to a blinding shine, and the secrets of the night were locked away behind the closed doors of the West Wing. Chloe did her best to vanish. She retreated deeper into the archives, burying herself in the scent of decaying paper and ink. She replayed the scene in the library 1,000 times, the look in Gabriel's eyes, the cruelty of his words, the confusing, terrifying heat that had pulsed between them. She told herself he was just like the rest of them, arrogant, dismissive, untouchable. She tried to hate him. It would have been safer to hate him. But hatred requires a hard heart, and Chloe's heart was traitorously soft. She worked late into the nights, preferring the company of ghosts to the possibility of running into the living. The East Wing was drafty in November, the estate's heating system was antiquated, and the warmth rarely reached the corners where the staff worked. Chloe wore fingerless gloves to type, her breath misting in the dim light of the desk lamp. It was nearly midnight on Thursday when the temperature in the library suddenly shifted. It wasn't a draft. It was a presence. Chloe looked up from her cataloging. Gabriel was there. He hadn't used the door. He had come through the shadows of the stacks, silent as a panther. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo this time. He was dressed in a charcoal wool coat over a casual sweater, looking less like a politician and more like a man wandering through a dream he couldn't wake up from. He stood by the fireplace, which had been cold for decades. He held a bundle of kindling and a box of long matches. "The heating is broken in this wing," Gabriel said without looking at her. He knelt before the grate, his movements precise and deliberate. "It's unacceptable." Chloe sat frozen, her pen hovering over the page. The master of the house was kneeling on the floor, doing the work of a servant. He struck a match, the flare illuminating the sharp planes of his face, casting deep hollows under his eyes. He looked exhausted, haunted. "You don't have to do that, sir," Chloe whispered, the "sir" tasting like ash in her mouth. "I have a code." "It's not enough," Gabriel replied, his voice low. The fire caught, crackling hungrily against the dry wood. He stood up, dusting the ash from his hands, but he didn't leave. He walked over to her desk, stopping just at the edge of the light. He looked at the gloves on her hands. He looked at the shivering hunch of her shoulders. And in his eyes, the ice melted, revealing a depth of sorrow that frightened her. "I was harsh the other night," Gabriel said. It wasn't quite an apology. Men like Gabriel Ashcroft didn't apologize, but it was an admission. The storm put everyone on edge. "I understand," Chloe said, lowering her gaze to the ledger. "I am just the archivist. I shouldn't be seen." "Is that what you think?" Gabriel asked. He took a step closer, invading her sanctuary. "That you shouldn't be seen? That is what you told me," she countered softly, finding a thread of courage. Gabriel winced. The truth of his protection was a blade he had to swallow daily. He couldn't tell her that he insulted her to make her invisible to his enemies. He couldn't tell her that if his father, the ruthless Senator Ashcroft, saw him looking at her with anything other than disdain, she would be fired within the hour. He loved her in silence, because the world would destroy her if they knew the noise in his heart. "Words are tools, Chloe," Gabriel murmured, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his tongue was intimate, a caress disguised as a sentence. "Sometimes we use them to build, and sometimes we use them to bury things we cannot afford to show." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped package. He placed it on the desk, right on top of the ancient documents. It was a chocolate bar. Expensive, imported dark chocolate from the pantry he wasn't supposed to raid. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You skip dinner when you work late. I've noticed." Chloe stared at the chocolate. He noticed. The man who ruled the city, who had senators on speed dial, noticed that the archivist missed dinner. The gap between them, measured in millions of dollars and centuries of pedigree, suddenly felt terrifyingly small. She reached for the chocolate, her fingers brushing against his hand that still rested on the desk. The contact was electric. It wasn't a spark. It was a jolt that went straight to the bone. Gabriel didn't pull away. He froze, his breath hitching. His hand turned over, catching hers, his thumb grazing the pulse point of her wrist. It was a forbidden touch, a violation of every rule in the Ashcroft handbook. For a heartbeat, the library dissolved. There was no campaign, no legacy, no poverty. Just a man and a woman in the firelight. "You have ink on your fingers," Gabriel whispered, staring at her hand as if it were a rare artifact. "It's part of the job," Chloe breathed, unable to look away from his obsidian eyes. "It's beautiful," he said. He leaned in. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and longing. He was going to kiss her. The realization paralyzed Chloe with desire and terror. If he kissed her, she was ruined. If he kissed her, she was saved. But the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway shattered the moment like glass. Gabriel ripped his hand away instantly, his body snapping back into a rigid posture of authority. He turned his back to her, facing the fire, just as the library doors swung open. A man walked in. He was older version of Gabriel, but harder, colder. Senator William Ashcroft. and beside him was a woman, sleek, blonde, and radiating the kind of polished perfection that money buys. Victoria Vance, the daughter of a media tycoon. Gabriel! The senator's voice was a boom of thunder. What are you doing in the archives? Victoria has been waiting in the parlor for 20 minutes. Gabriel didn't turn immediately. He took a second to compose his mask, to kill the man who had just held Chloe's hand. When he turned, his face was stone. I was checking the fire, Father, Gabriel said coolly. The draft was threatening the manuscripts. We can't have the assets damaged by neglect. Assets? Victoria laughed lightly, walking into the room. She glanced at Chloe with a dismissive, bored expression, not seeing a rival, but a piece of furniture. You worry too much about dusty old books, Gabriel. That's what you hire people for. She walked up to Gabriel and looped her arm through his possessively. Come, darling. We need to discuss the engagement announcement. The press release is going out on Monday. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. Engagement. Gabriel didn't look at Chloe. He couldn't. He let Victoria lead him toward the door, his body stiff. But just before they crossed the threshold, he paused. Ensure the fire doesn't go out, Gabriel said to the room, his voice flat and command-like. Senator Ashcroft and Victoria assumed he was talking about the wood in the grate. But Chloe, clutching the chocolate bar in her ink-stained hand, watching the man she was falling for walk away with a woman who owned the world, knew better. He wasn't talking about the hearth. He was talking about the dangerous, fragile spark between them that he had just been forced to smother in the dark. The obstacle wasn't just class anymore, it was a ring. And Chloe was left alone in the warmth he had made for her, shivering in the cold reality of his departure. The announcement of Gabriel Ashcroft's engagement to Victoria Vance did not come as a whisper, it arrived as a roar. It was splashed across every newspaper, broadcast on every morning show, and celebrated within the estate with a ferocity that felt less like a wedding preparation and more like a coronation. For Chloe, the news was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until breathing became a conscious, painful effort. She sat in the archives, surrounded by the smell of decaying paper, holding the newspaper she shouldn't have bought. The photograph on the front page was perfection. Gabriel, looking devastatingly handsome in black tie, standing on the balcony with Victoria. Her hand rested on his chest, displaying a diamond ring that caught the light like a star. It was a flawless image of power and unity. But Chloe, who had memorized the map of Gabriel's face in the firelight, saw what the cameras missed. She saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the deadness in his eyes. He wasn't holding Victoria. He was holding himself up. A cage made of gold is still a cage, only harder to break. Chloe knew she should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to pack her meager belongings and flee before the ceremony destroyed whatever pride she had left. But the scholarship contract bound her to the estate for another month, and she had nowhere else to go. She was trapped in the orbit of his life, forced to watch the man she loved prepare to marry a woman who saw him as an asset. The torture intensified on Friday. The senator demanded a special display of the family's rarest first editions to be set up in the main drawing room for the engagement party. Chloe was summoned to arrange it. She moved through the drawing room like a specter, placing the priceless books on velvet stands. The room was buzzing with florists and planners, but she was invisible to them. She was just a pair of hands. "Move the Shakespeare to the center," a voice commanded. Chloe stiffened. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Gabriel. She could feel him. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his presence. She turned slowly. He was standing a few feet away, watching her. He looked thinner, his face drawn, the shadows under his eyes stark against his pale skin. He wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at her hands, trembling as they adjusted the display. "It's done, sir," Chloe whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. She tried to step past him, to escape back to the safety of the library. "Chloe, wait!" Gabriel's voice was a rough plea, low enough so the nearby florist wouldn't hear. He stepped into her path, blocking her exit. "I have work to do, Mr. Ashcroft," she said, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Don't call me that," he hissed, pain flashing across his face. Not after the fire." "The fire is out," Chloe replied, her heart breaking with every word. "You made sure of that when you walked out with her." "I didn't have a choice," Gabriel whispered urgently, stepping closer, the scent of his despair overwhelming her. "My father. He has leverage you don't understand. If I don't marry her, he dissolves the trust. He sells the estate. He destroys everything I've spent my life protecting. And so you sell yourself instead?" Chloe looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "You trade your life for a building, Gabriel? That's not noble. That's tragic." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He reached out, grabbing her arm to pull her into the shadow of a heavy curtain, away from the prying eyes of the staff. "It's not just the building," he choked out, his grip tight, desperate. "It's the power. If I have the seat, if I have the control, I can change things. I can be free." "You will never be free," Chloe whispered, shaking her head. "Not if you build your foundation on a lie." For a moment, they stood suspended in the shadows, the noise of the party prep fading away. Gabriel looked at her, this woman with nothing to her name but her integrity, and he realized she was the only thing in his life that wasn't for sale. The hunger in his eyes returned, fierce and undeniable. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, stolen second. "I would burn it all down," he breathed against her skin. "If I knew you would survive the fire." He loved her in silence, because the world would destroy her if they knew. "Well, isn't this a touching scene?" The voice cut through the air like a guillotine. Gabriel ripped himself away from Chloe, spinning around. Standing in the doorway of the drawing room, leaning on his cane like a weapon, was Senator William Ashcroft. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He had seen the intimacy. He had seen the weakness. The room went silent. The florist stopped working. The planners froze. "Father," Gabriel started, his voice steadying into a protective steel. "I was just reprimanding the archivist. The display was incorrect." "Do not lie to me, boy," the senator growled, walking slowly into the room. The sound of his cane hitting the hardwood echoed like gunshots. He stopped in front of Chloe, looking her up and down with pure disgust. He didn't see a human being. He saw a weed in his perfectly manicured garden. "You," the senator addressed Chloe, his voice dripping with venom. "I knew you were a problem the moment I saw you. A stray dog sniffing around the table, looking for scraps." "I was doing my job," Chloe said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "Your job," the senator laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Your job is to be invisible. But instead, you are distracting my son. You are endangering a merger worth billions. Do you know what happens to stray dogs who bite the hand that feeds them?" He turned to Gabriel. "She is a liability, Gabriel. A scandal waiting to happen. If the press catches wind of you whispering in corners with the help, the campaign is over. Victoria walks. The funding vanishes." The senator stepped closer to Chloe, his eyes narrowing. "I think it's time we remove the problem. I will have security escort her out. And I will make sure every institution in this country knows she was fired for theft." "Theft!" Chloe gasped. "I never stole anything." "Who will they believe?" the senator sneered. "The Ashcroft patriarch, or the foster girl with no family?" Chloe looked at Gabriel. This was the moment he could stop it, the moment he could tell the truth. She waited for him to step between her and his father. She waited for the hero. But Gabriel looked at his father, seeing the absolute malice in the old man's eyes. He knew his father wasn't bluffing. If Chloe fought this, the senator would destroy her. He would plant evidence. He would ruin her name so thoroughly she would never work again. He would crush her just to teach Gabriel a lesson. Gabriel realized with a sickening clarity that the only way to save her future was to break her heart right now. He stiffened his spine. He locked his jaw. He turned his eyes, now cold and dead as obsidian, onto Chloe. "She doesn't need to be escorted, father," Gabriel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She is leaving." He looked directly at Chloe, delivering the final blow. "You are dismissed, miss, whatever your name is. My father is right. You are a distraction. And frankly, your work has been substandard. Pack your things. Get out of my house." The words tore through Chloe like shrapnel. Substandard? Distraction. He didn't just fail to defend her. He joined the execution squad. She stared at him, searching for a sign, a flicker of the man who had held her hand in the library. But there was nothing. Just the Ashcroft heir, standing beside his father, closing ranks against the outsider. "I understand," Chloe whispered. The sound was the death rattle of her hope. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply placed the clipboard on the table with a soft click. She turned and walked past the senator, past the florists who were staring at their shoes, and walked out of the drawing room. Gabriel watched her go. He stood perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his fingernails digging into his palms until they drew blood. He watched the only woman he had ever loved walk out of his life, believing he was a monster. He let her hate him because hate would keep her warm. Hate would keep her away. And most importantly, hate would keep her safe from the destruction his world brought upon everything it touched. The separation was absolute, brutal, and silent. 2 weeks, that is enough time to starve a hope, but it is not enough to kill a memory. Chloe had moved into a small, drafty studio apartment on the edge of the city, funded by the meager severance pay the estate's legal team had wired her, a payment coldly labeled nuisance settlement. She had stopped watching the news. She couldn't bear to see the flashing cameras, the gilded ballrooms, or the face of the man who had looked her in the eye and called her substandard. She was working at a dusty used bookstore now, shelving paperbacks for minimum wage, trying to forget the smell of beeswax and rain, trying to forget the feeling of Gabriel's hand covering hers. But the silence of her new life was loud. It was a vacuum where his voice echoed constantly, repeating the dismissal that had shattered her world. "We survived the crash, but we often die in the wreckage that on the night of the engagement party, the event that was supposed to seal the Ashcroft-Vance merger, a blizzard struck the city. Snow piled up against the thin windows of Chloe's apartment, sealing her in. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, packing a suitcase. She was leaving tomorrow. A bus ticket to Ohio was on the table. She couldn't stay in the same state as him. Suddenly, a heavy pounding on her door made her jump. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a neighbor. It was frantic, desperate. Chloe grabbed a heavy brass bookend for protection and crept to the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Chloe, open the door." The voice was unrecognizable, hoarse, broken, raw, but the cadence was familiar. It was the voice of the library, stripped of its polish. She unlocked the deadbolt with shaking fingers and pulled the door open. Gabriel Ashcroft fell into the room. He didn't walk in. He collapsed. He looked like a man who had walked through the blizzard on foot. His tuxedo was ruined, the expensive fabric soaked and torn. His face was pale, his lips blue from the cold, and his eyes were wild. He wasn't the senator's son tonight. He was a refugee. "You left," he rasped, leaning against the wall as if his legs could no longer hold him. "I went to 3 different addresses. You weren't there." Chloe clutched the bookend, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I moved. I'm leaving the state tomorrow. You shouldn't be here, Gabriel. The party, the engagement. There is no party," Gabriel said, sliding down the wall until he hit the floor. He sat there, shivering, looking up at her with a devastation that stole the breath from her lungs. "I didn't go. I didn't go to the ballroom, Chloe. I went to the press room. I issued a statement. I withdrew from the Senate race. I declined the endorsement. And I broke the engagement. The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe dropped the bookend with a dull thud. She stared at him, unable to process the magnitude of what he was saying. He had just detonated his entire life. He had burned the legacy his father had spent 50 years building. "Why?" she breathed. "You said it was everything. You said you had no choice." "I lied," Gabriel whispered. He reached into his soaked jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, wet piece of paper. He held it out to her. Chloe took it. It wasn't a love letter. It was a legal document. It detailed a transfer of assets, Gabriel's personal trust fund, his shares in the family company, his properties. He had signed them all over to the family in exchange for one thing. "Read the clause at the bottom," Gabriel urged softly. Chloe read the bold text. In exchange for full divestment, the Ashcroft Estate agrees to cease all surveillance and legal action against Chloe Miller. Violation results in the public release of a senator's private archives. She gasped, looking up at him. You blackmailed your father?" Gabriel admitted it with a dark, pained smile. "I used the archives. You weren't the only one reading the ledgers, Chloe. I found the discrepancies. I knew where the bodies were buried, but I couldn't use it while you were still in the house. He would have hurt you to get to me. He would have framed you just to discredit anything I leaked." He pulled himself up, swaying slightly, and took a step toward her. "I had to get you out," Gabriel choked out, the tears finally mixing with the melting snow on his face. "I had to make him believe I didn't care about you. I had to make you hate me, because if you stayed one more day, he would have destroyed you. I had to break your heart to save your life. The cruelest lies are the ones we tell to protect the people we love." Chloe looked at the document, then at the man standing in her cheap, freezing apartment. He had stripped himself of his title, his fortune, and his future, all to ensure she was safe from a threat she hadn't even fully understood. He hadn't rejected her because she was substandard. He had rejected her because she was the only thing precious enough to be used against him. "You gave up everything," Chloe whispered, the realization bringing her to her knees. She dropped the paper and reached out, her hands hovering near his ruined tuxedo. "The Senate seat. The money. Gabriel, I'm free," Gabriel finished. He collapsed to his knees in front of her, eliminating the height difference, eliminating the class difference. He was just a man on the floor, begging for forgiveness. "I am nothing now, Chloe. I have no name. I have no power. I have nothing to offer you but the truth. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him touch you." He looked into her eyes, searching for a sign that he hadn't destroyed the bridge between them permanently. "I hurt you," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I called you a distraction. I watched you walk away. It was the hardest thing I have ever done." Chloe saw the agony in his eyes. She saw the sacrifice. She realized that while she had been mourning a rejection, he had been fighting a war in silence. He had loved her enough to become the villain in her story, just to ensure she survived to have a story at all. She reached out and touched his wet face, her thumb brushing away a droplet of water. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, letting out a shuddering breath. "You're an idiot, Gabriel Ashcroft," Chloe whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he agreed. "You could have told me." Gabriel opened his eyes, dark, intense, and filled with a terrifying amount of love. "I couldn't risk it. You are not a good liar, Chloe. If you looked at me with love in front of him, he would have known. I needed you to look at me with hate. I tried," she admitted, tears spilling over. "I tried so hard to hate you." Gabriel looked at her, vulnerable and stripped of his armor. "Did it work?" Chloe looked at the man who had burned down his kingdom just to keep her warm. "No," she whispered. She pulled him forward, wrapping her arms around his wet shoulders, holding him tight. Gabriel buried his face in her neck, clinging to her as if she were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. They were two refugees in a cold apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of his past and the uncertainty of her future. But as she held him in the quiet of the blizzard, Chloe realized that for the first time, he was finally hers to hold. The blizzard broke at dawn. The morning light that filtered into Chloe's apartment was blindingly white, reflecting off the banks of snow that had piled up against the window panes. It was a clean, sharp light, the kind that exposes everything it touches. Inside, the air was still, but it was no longer heavy with the scent of wet wool and desperation. It smelled of coffee and the quiet, settling dust of a new reality. Chloe woke on the sofa, covered by the blanket Gabriel had tucked around her hours ago. He hadn't slept. He was sitting on the floor by the window, watching the city wake up under its blanket of ice. He was still wearing the ruined trousers of his tuxedo and a borrowed sweater of hers that was too tight in the shoulders, but he looked more comfortable than he ever had in the tailored suits of the Ashcroft Estate. She watched him for a moment, tracing the silhouette of the man who had burned down his own life to keep her warm. The news vans were likely already circling the estate miles away, hungry for the story of the senator's son who had abdicated his throne. But here, in this fourth-floor walk-up, the only news that mattered was the steady rise and fall of his chest. "You're staring," Gabriel said softly, without turning around. His voice was rough, but the tension that had defined his posture for months was gone. "I'm trying to see if you look different," Chloe replied, sitting up and pulling the blanket tighter around her. "You're not a billionaire anymore, Gabriel. Technically, you're unemployed." Gabriel turned then, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile Chloe had never seen, unguarded, boyish, and entirely free of irony. "I look like a man who finally quit a job he hated," he said. "Do you know what I was thinking about just now? The Senate seat." "No," he shook his head, resting his arm on his knee. "I was thinking about the library. That first day. I was so angry that you were there because I knew, the moment I saw you, that the walls I had built were going to fail. I spent 20 years curating a legacy of stone and silence, and it took you 5 minutes with a glue brush to make me realize I was living in a tomb." Chloe stood up and walked to him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She sat beside him on the floor, leaning her head on his shoulder. "They will say you were foolish," she whispered. "They will say she wasn't worth it." "Let them talk," Gabriel said, reaching for her hand. He interlaced their fingers, marveling at the simple freedom of the gesture. "They are fighting for seats at a table where the food tastes like ash. I have everything I need right here." The transition wasn't seamless. The weeks that followed were a chaotic storm of lawyers, paparazzi, and the brutal dismantling of Gabriel's former identity. The senator raged, threatening lawsuits that had no teeth because Gabriel held the archives, the digital copies of the ledgers that ensured their silence. The Ashcroft dynasty retreated behind their gates to spin the narrative, painting Gabriel as mentally unstable, a victim of a breakdown. But Gabriel didn't fight the narrative. He let them have their story. He had the truth. They moved away from the city, finding a small, weathered house on the coast of Maine, far from the reach of the Potomac and the prying eyes of Washington. It was a house that needed work. The roof leaked, the floors creaked, and the wind howled through the eaves. But for the first time, Gabriel wasn't hiring a staff to fix it. He was learning to use a hammer. He was learning to sand wood. He was learning that a home is built with hands, not with checks. Chloe found a job at a local library, a small building that smelled of salt air and pine. She no longer felt invisible. When she walked home in the evenings, Gabriel was there, often covered in sawdust or paint, waiting for her on the porch. One evening, 6 months later, they sat by a fire Gabriel had built in their small living room. It wasn't the roaring, decorative fire of the Ashcroft Library. It was a working fire, built for warmth. Gabriel was reading a book, a paperback, dog-eared and worn, while Chloe sketched in her notebook. She stopped and looked at him. The firelight danced across his face, softening the sharp angles. He looked up, sensing her gaze, and the connection between them hummed with a quiet, steady power. "Do you miss it?" Chloe asked suddenly. "The power? The way people looked at you when you walked into a room." Gabriel closed the book. He looked into the flames for a long moment, then turned his obsidian eyes to her. "I miss nothing," he said with absolute certainty. "In that world, I was a ghost haunting my own life. I was watching myself perform a script written by dead men. Here, I am just Gabriel, and that is the only title I ever wanted." He moved from the chair to the rug beside her, taking her face in his hands. The touch was no longer forbidden, it was essential. He loved her in silence, because the world would destroy her if they knew. "I used to repeat that to myself," Gabriel whispered, his thumb tracing her lip, reading her thoughts as the leitmotif echoed between them one last time. "I thought silence was protection. I thought that if I kept my love in the dark, it would be safe." "You were wrong," Chloe murmured, leaning into his touch. "I was," he agreed. "Love doesn't survive in the dark, Chloe. It rots. It needs the light. It needs to be spoken out loud, even if the whole world screams against it." "The world isn't screaming anymore," she said softly. "It forgot us." "Good." Gabriel smiled and he kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and freedom, a kiss that held the weight of every sacrifice and the lightness of every burden dropped. They had lost the estate. They had lost the fortune. They had lost the approval of the world. But as the fire crackled in the hearth of their imperfect, drafty home, they realized they had won the only war that mattered. They had escaped the mausoleum of expectations and walked into the messy, beautiful land of the living. Chloe looked at the man who had been the billionaire everyone feared, now just a man in a sweater holding the woman he adored. She realized that his walls hadn't just been ruined by her kindness, they had been replaced by something stronger. They had been replaced by a door that was always open and a fire that would never go out. He spent a lifetime building a fortress to keep the world out, never realizing that the only way to save his life was to let it crumble, so he could finally hold the hand of the woman standing in the rubble.